We've had some great questions come in about foot and knee alignment in a couple of our foundational back bends in yoga. In bridge pose, so this yoga back bend, bridge, and then also in wheel, Urdhva Dhanurasana. So that's our arms overhead back bend. So these questions, they all pertain to wondering how important it is that we keep our feet and our knees hip distance apart and our feet pointing straight forward. So how important is this in these back bends? And we've received multiple questions along these lines. And so I'm not going to read the specific questions this time because they're all about a common theme. And I know that this is also just a common question that comes up in general in the yoga world because we tend to be taught traditionally that yes, it is important that in bridge pose and in wheel pose, we keep this alignment of feet hip distance, knees hip distance, and that we definitely do not let the feet turn out, the knees track out, and or the feet go wider than hip distance apart. So all of this, which is basically a hip abducted position. So when the thighs track out away from midline, that's hip abduction. So the idea that we tend to be taught in yoga land is that bridge and wheel in hip abduction, that this is incorrect, wrong, and not only that, but that it's inherently injurious and that it's bad for us. So that's at least what I experience and have seen many, many times out there, that we tend to be warned against positionings like bridge pose with the feet and the knees wide. We tend to be warned that this is inherently injurious and at all costs we should avoid it, and we should bring the feet and the knees to hip distance and only do this pose and also wheel, only do them in that alignment. So that's kind of the prevailing approach to these poses that is out there in the yoga world, and that's what we tend to learn. But then things get a little confusing, I find, because then we go out into yoga classes and we tend to notice that many yoga students do not embody bridge and wheel pose in that alignment. It's super common to see people in these poses with the feet turned out and wider and the knees reaching out. That's really common to see. And so I know that could get confusing and a little conflicting because it's like, well, I was taught that was bad and incorrect and that the only correct way was feet forward and hip distance apart. So what am I supposed to do? If I'm a teacher, do I correct that? Do I worry about my students who I see doing that? Like just all of this. So that's what my answer here, that's what this is all about. And what I want to do first and foremost is just basically reassure us there really isn't anything we need to be worrying about when it comes to this question. It is not inherently injurious for the hips to move into abduction and for the feet to turn out and the knees to reach out. That's not injurious for us in these poses at all. In fact, it can be really advantageous. So we talked about how in bridge pose, we use our glutes and we use like especially gluteus maximus along the back side of the hips to lift us up in bridge and also in wheel in both of those. So gluteus maximus is very involved in those poses. There are other posterior hip muscles also involved, but that's kind of a big one that we tend to talk about. So I just think this is interesting to point out because I'm not sure that we're all aware of this, but so gluteus maximus, if that is a muscle that we are particularly interested in targeting, like maybe it's one that we just really want to quote activate or something like that, it's interesting to note that just anatomical structure wise, when it comes to gluteus maximus, the fibers of gluteus maximus, they actually run obliquely. They run at a diagonal angle. So it's kind of like out laterally. They don't run straight up and down. For example, if you compare that to our hamstrings muscles, which are a group of 3 muscles along the backs of the thighs, their fiber direction is more just straight up and down, more vertical. But gluteus maximus is actually out more lateral. That's its fiber direction. And so because of that, and this may be a little bit like, what? But because of the fiber direction of gluteus maximus, gluteus maximus is actually put in a better position to work, to be recruited, to be activated. It's in a better position to work when we are in a position of hip abduction. So when the legs are a little wider as opposed to being hugged in at hip distance, because that position of like slightly lateral legs better aligns with the fiber direction of gluteus maximus. So gluteus maximus still absolutely works in a hip distance bridge and a hip distance wheel. It absolutely does, but it probably works more in a position of wider thighs, wider femurs, hip abduction. And we actually have research to suggest this. Like here is a study that I'll flash up that looked specifically at this. It looked at gluteus maximus activation in a position of, it wasn't performed standing like I'm showing, but I'm just going to show position of neutral as far as abduction goes. And then it was like, I think it was 15 degrees of abduction. And then it was 30 degrees of abduction. So the hip in all of those three different positions where we were performing like hip extension. So hip extension in 0 degrees of abduction, in 15 degrees, and in 30, which is more abduction. And what this research suggested was that gluteus maximus was activated the most in 30 degrees of abduction compared to 0. So it, like I said, it still, of course, worked in 0, but it worked more the further out the leg went, or at least within 0 to 30 degrees. So that's just to suggest that hopefully we can maybe start to see that I think this is really good evidence for why I believe this yoga alignment rule that we tend to be taught, which is that bridge and wheel are safer, better, and more correct when everything is hip distance and the feet point straight forward. I think that that is an example of aesthetics over biomechanics, because clearly we actually recruit gluteus maximus more in more hip abduction, and that's fine. And there's nothing inherently injurious about that. So this is all just to say, I mean, we don't necessarily care or want to specifically be targeting gluteus maximus in these poses, but we might. And so I just want to point out that like we actually will recruit gluteus maximus more if we're in more abduction. So that's just to point out some research that's been done, like exercise science research on posterior hip muscular recruitment in those positions. But aside from just knowing that gluteus maximus works more in more hip abduction, I also think it's important for us to think about foot and knee alignment and bridge and wheel. And let's compare this question to what we've already talked about foot and knee alignment with malasana, or our squat pose. So I feel like it's maybe a little easier to see and comprehend when we're talking about a squat for some reason, maybe because we're upright. But we talked about how, although we tend to hear in the yoga world that it's important in malasana that the feet point straight forward and everything once again should be aligned according to straight lines as we go down, what we actually know is that the human body is variable, and the structure of our joints, especially hip, knee, and ankle joints, really require that different bodies embody a squat differently. And so not it's not, feet straight forward is not like the best fit for every body, and far from it. Many people, depending especially on hip structure, many people find a more easeful and a better fit for them, a better squat with their feet turned out and allowing the knees to track out. So it's like kind of similar. Some people, on the other hand, are just fine in a squat with the feet parallel. That works for many bodies, but for many other bodies, letting the feet turn out is just a better fit for them. So that's why in malasana, it's a great idea as a yoga teacher to allow students' bodies to self-organize and to not micromanage them from the top down, and really try to change their alignment so that they fit into these alignment boxes that we tend to be taught in yoga that are all straight lines and right angles. Because we know the human body does not have any straight lines or right angles in it at all. And we also know that the human body is variable. So, teach our yoga poses with using alignment in a big picture sense, tell someone for a squat, step your feet, a comfortable distance apart and lower down, teach them general cues. But when it comes to the actual pose itself, we don't really want to micromanage because students' bodies will do that themselves. So it's no different. We were talking about the squat here, but it's no different when it comes to bridge pose and wheel pose. Everyone's bodies are different, our joint structures are different, and some people will simply be more comfortable in these poses in more of an abducted position. And some people, maybe a better fit for them is to have the feet hip distance. So we're all different. And that's just joint structure. So I think this is one reason why we tend to see a lot of people in yoga with this kind of abducted alignment, because their joint structure is probably it's just a better fit for them to do the pose that way. But another reason that I think we often see that alignment, in addition to just joint structure, is also just simple flexibility. Because bridge and especially wheel pose, they have flexibility requirements. We need to have a certain amount of flexibility in the hip flexors that cross the front of the hip in order to come into these movements, and also the muscles of the front of the spine. So our anterior core muscles, all of this needs to be able to stretch in order for us to lift up. And like I said, especially in wheel. Wheel is more of a flexibility challenge than bridge. So not everybody has all of that range of motion. And when that's the case, it is we can kind of bypass, especially with the hip flexors, we can bypass their needing to be super flexible and stretched in the sagittal plane. We can bypass that by letting the legs track out a bit. Then these hip flexion muscles don't have to stretch as far, and we tend to find more space. So that's just yet another reason why I believe that many people in our backbends do naturally come into hip abduction, because of just a flexibility reason. They just have more space to move when they let the thighs track out laterally. So all of that is to basically suggest that, once again, as with just about all of our other yoga poses, I think it can be a great idea as a yoga teacher to teach the general shape of the pose, use alignment in the big picture, but then allow the individual bodies to self-organize within that context, within the container of the pose. Because only our students are in their bodies, and only our students feel their bodies and can allow everything to self-organize. So let's just come back to the original question about, feet straight forward, hip distance apart. Sometimes we see in yoga classes an attempt to get students to stick to this alignment by having everyone put a block in between their inner thighs and to lift up, hugging the block. And the idea there is often this block is a prop we use to keep us in, quote, good alignment in these poses. So you may have experienced this. This is pretty common in the yoga world. I definitely would suggest that there's nothing inherently wrong at all with using a block and hugging it in and lifting up. That's totally fine to do. But I'm not sure that I would suggest doing that for the purpose of getting everybody in the right alignment, because as we've established, hip distance and feet straight is not necessarily the best fit for everybody's body. So I would use this more for a different reason. For example, I don't know, maybe in bridge pose, having something to squeeze into gives you more of a sense of stability in the pose, because now you have this to hug into. Maybe you feel more stable. Also, maybe having the block allows you to, if you squeeze, you can activate your adductor muscles, the inner thighs, more. And maybe you just want in that moment to feel adductors working more as you lift up. So those could be some really nice ideas for using the block. And I would point out that personally, I think that even for people who have joint structures in which it's a better fit for their body to let the legs go out wide, for example, even then, I think most of those people would still be just fine having the feet hip distance and squeezing in. This isn't going to be a huge amount to bring it in for them to lift up. I'm just trying to say, I don't think it's bad to ask people who maybe They are a little more turned out, and maybe that's like a better fit in general. I don't think it's bad that sometimes we do have them hug in and lift up. It's rarely the case that someone would not be able to do this. So, and this is for bridge pose. So I think it's just fine to do this here with just about everybody in class, but just for the reasons I said, like you're squeezing in, you're feeling the adductors, maybe a little more stability, things like that, but not because it's teaching people the correct alignment. So I think hugging into the block and bridge is good and is fine for just about everybody to do, if you have an intention for that in the moment. But I don't necessarily think it's a good idea to have everybody do that in wheel pose, because as I've mentioned, wheel is much more, it utilizes a lot more flexibility. So it's a much more demanding pose in that sense. And I think in wheel pose, that's a pose where if we were to like force someone who really maybe they have retroverted hips, for example, that's a hip socket orientation and a hip joint orientation where the person really does feel like more easeful in a little more turned out position. So if someone has like a lot of hip retroversion, if we insist that they hug in and bring their feet in and point everything forward, and then we go all the way up there into full wheel like that, it just might not be possible for them. It might be counterproductive for them. It just might be too much, like really trying to hug everything in too much for their body. So I personally probably would not recommend teaching hugging into the block for full wheel, because I just think that's probably not going to be a great fit for many bodies. Some people will be just fine with it. Again, we're all different. For some people, it's excellent. And for them, maybe they like it, maybe they do want to use it. So, for someone for whom for their body, it's a good fit to have everything hugged in like that, and they're just fine in wheel, then why not, bring that in sometimes for them. But just for general population, for everybody, I'm not sure I would recommend it for wheel. So anyway, last thing I just wanted to say, so that was just to talk about the idea of hugging into the block, in bridge, and in wheel. I just wanted to say that if we, like hugging into the block sometimes, knowing that that's one option, but it's not necessarily correct or something we should always do, we should also realize maybe we think a little more broadly about this. We just as well might like to take something like a resistance band. I know we don't have this in, most yoga class contexts, but say you did, or this was just you in your home practice. Maybe you have one of these. But anyway, you could take a band around your knees, and instead of hugging into the block and squeezing in, you could press out into the band and lift up like this. So pressing out to lift up is completely valid and is a whole other way to embody and feel both of these poses. Like maybe we want a little resistance to push out into, and in that case, instead of lighting up the adductors, the inner thighs, this would be lighting up more of the abductors, the lateral thighs in these poses. And that may be interesting and may be informative and maybe something that you might like to work on. So just to kind of point out the alternate, because I think we tend to think in the yoga world that hugging in is best, and that's what we should teach, and we should all squeeze the block. It could be just as beneficial and interesting to try pressing out into something like this and to see how that goes. So basically, I hope that I covered this topic. I think I said everything I wanted to say. I guess I would just add as a final note that in general, I don't think it's bad to tell people or suggest that they put their feet hip distance and then lift up, especially in bridge, because like we said, bridge is less demanding than wheel pose. Because that's just the general shape of the pose. And we are teaching a pose. We want to offer, big picture alignment cues to bring people into the general shape of the pose we're teaching. So I'm not advocating that we don't teach like hip distance apart. I think that's a fine starting place for people, especially for bridge. Maybe not so much for wheel, it depends. But I guess the main point is, like, for sure we could say hip distance apart in bridge. I say that all the time in my teaching, but I'm just not going to be a stickler about it. I wouldn't walk around in the yoga room and see someone with their feet turned out a little and tell them to correct it, or see someone with their feet a little wider than hip and tell them to bring it in. Like I wouldn't do that. I would allow students' bodies to self-organize. So as a starting point, yeah, maybe feet hip distance apart, but then just let it go and let students' bodies do what they're going to do. As long as they have their feet roughly, a distance apart, and then they're lifting their hips up, then they're doing the pose. That's at least how I approach it. So hopefully that helps kind of put this in perspective. It's, teach the big picture alignment cues, but then support our students in self-organizing and trusting and knowing maybe a little more about the science of movement, some of the stuff I presented today, so we could be more informed and less fearful and less fear-mongering as well when we're teaching yoga alignment. There are really a lot more possibilities that we have that are completely safe and can be very beneficial on our hands, like in a yoga context. So we can maybe be a little more open-minded when it comes to the yoga alignment that we use and cue.